afternoon. Welcome to a virtual lecture offered through the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. My name is Clemens Sedmark and I'm the interim director of the Institute. And we are very grateful to see all of you here, and especially to see Ingrid Rowland. I have the honor of introducing Professor Ingrid Rowland. We always say that our speaker is brilliant and that it is a huge privilege to work with her. And sometimes this is even true. Today, it is true. Ingrid Rowland is a brilliant scholar. It is such a privilege and delight to work with her. She's amazing, she's gracious, and she has a great sense of humor. Ingrid Rowland is a professor at the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture, but she's so much more. She's a fellow of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies, but she's so much more. She's a citizen of the world and is specifically a citizen of Rome, but she's so much more. Ingrid writes and lectures on classical antiquity, the Renaissance, and the age of the Baroque for general as well as specialist readers. She has been trained in classics, in Greek literature, and in classical archaeology. She's a public intellectual and is a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books. She has made a global impact with her books on the 16th century Rome, on Giordano Bruno, on Pompeii, on Giorgio Vasari. I do not have the time to mention her numerous awards and distinctions. Let me just mention a few. Professor Rowland has been a fellow of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, the American Academy in Rome, the Villa Itati in Florence, and the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the corresponding member of the Accademia dei Sepolti of Volterra and the Accademia degli Intronati of Siena. She was also awarded the Society of Italian Historical Studies Howard Marraro Prize for her book on Giordano Bruno. We are very grateful that Ingrid has kindly agreed to give a virtual lecture today. Professor Rowland's lecture is entitled Raphael in Rome. She will take us to 16th century Rome to witness the transformation of a promising young painter into an artistic entrepreneur of a kind that Italy had never seen before. Ingrid will lecture for about 30 minutes and then we will have a time for Q&A. Please make use of the Q&A button that you will find on your screen and we will be enriched by Ingrid's answers. Ingrid, so many thanks. We're excited to listen to this drama. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Clemens, for this really kind introduction. And thank you, Nanovic, for all your support always. It's really been wonderful. As you may know, I'm lecturing from Rome, so I'm sitting in Trastevere. There may be Roman cats that enter the picture. And like you, we've been experiencing COVID, which meant that it was very exciting that on June 2nd, the day that the Raphael blockbuster show was supposed to close, it finally reopened to the public. And I got to go 3 times where you were driven through each room, 5 minutes per room, 12 rooms, a rest in the middle, and you could have stayed there all day. And so what I'm really going to talk about in a very informal way are some of the things that struck me this time around after many, many, many years spent in Rome puzzling out Raphael and the world around him. So let's share the screen. And here he is before he'd ever gotten to Rome. This is a drawing from the Ashmolean Museum. And you could see that Raphael, like Leonardo, was all eyes. And he's one of those artists, many of them, Picasso's another person I can think of, where they are so acutely visual that their own eyes are riveting and they see the riveting eyes in every other living creature. But this is the young man who lost his parents by the time that he was apprenticeship age. His mother died when he was 8. I think his dad died when he was 11. And he was apprenticed to a series of people, ended up in Florence, which was the artistic center, and then came down to Rome. But you could see in a way, almost everything in that face. It's already there, and mostly what you see is eye and brain and incredibly deft hand. This is one of his early paintings. Again, this is done before Rome. And the peculiarity of this Raphael show is that it was put in the former pontifical stables with big halls in the bottom and smaller halls on the top, which meant they ran the chronology backwards. So it was Raphael 1520 to 1483. You started with the end of his career and ended up with the beginning. And this is the drawing for one of the earliest paintings in the entire show that for me really symbolizes everything that Raphael wanted to do with himself. This is a combination of two ancient myths, or actually it's an ancient historical story from Cicero and the ancient myth of the choice of Hercules, where Hercules meets two beautiful women, one more beautiful than the other. One offers the easy road of pleasure and the other one offers the arduous road of virtue. And then what you see here is somebody dressed as a knight. And so this is Cicero's Dream of Scipio, where it's a future Roman general dreaming about the virtue that's reserved for good people in heaven. And so here what you've got is a young knight at the crossroads trying to figure out what he's going to do with his life. Is he going to take the virtuous tack, or is he going to go after pleasure? And the thing about Raphael is he decided to go for both. The knight's head is inclined towards virtue, but his feet are definitely on the side of pleasure. She's not really vice, she's just voluptuous. She's got a much fancier robe than her sister. You can see she's holding it in a rather lascivious manner, and she's holding out a flower. At this point, you can't really tell what kind of a flower it is. It's young Raphael saying it's a flower. He will become incredibly correct with his botany, as with everything else. And behind is this ravishing landscape. And a laurel tree, the symbol of virtue, but it's not acting like a laurel tree. Laurel is a bush. And so here what you have is a young man, extremely clever, talented at mixing paints, talented at painting figures, every hope in the world in his head. But he's going to get so much better that things like the suit of armor where this pot belly is a little bit out of place. He's not really perfectly proportioned. The women aren't perfectly proportioned, her thighs too long. All of this will go away in a life that's very short, 37 years, but devoted to relentless self-criticism and amazing hard work. Raphael landscapes always go back layer after layer after layer. He looked at Leonardo da Vinci when he was in Florence, and he learned. He got his start in Rome with Pope Julius II, whom he eventually painted in this wonderful painting. It's now in the National Gallery in London, but was in the show. And what you see is a man who is so active that he hates sitting down for 5 minutes. You can see he's clutching the chair. He just wants out. But he's also thinking. And so you don't see his eyes. What you see is what turns out to be a characteristic pose. Nobody's ever painted Julius II face on, even when he was just Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere. He was one of the most aggressive men who ever lived. And here he is staring down his cousin, Raphael Riario, who's no slouch, standing literally as the pillar that holds up the Vatican Library, with which he had a founding role. And here he is with his uncle, Pope Sixtus IV. And you can tell he's the alpha male in this room. And here's Julius, when he was Cardinal Giuliano, painted in the 1480s on the wall of the Sistine Chapel. And you see, he's got that same expression. Even though he said he was a man of action and he didn't think much about books, he was not being entirely honest about himself. He thought all the time. And one of the things he thought about is what he'd do with Rome if he ever became Pope. He made sure that he smoothed away by bribing all the cardinals to elect him in a rather shameless series of bribes, most of them carried out in the latrines of the Sistine Chapel when everybody was locked in the conclave. The latrine was the one place where you could really talk, but this man had in his head a plan for Rome that was to make it a magnificent Christian capital, so magnificent. The idea was that any foreigner who came, especially Muslims from the Ottoman Empire, the beauty of Rome would be such that they would be converted on the spot. Raphael's first assignment was this wall in the Pope's private suite, where he lays out the whole pattern of theology. And you've got here the motley mass of all of us down in the earthly realm. And then perched on clouds, you have Hebrew prophets and Christian saints, Peter and Paul, the two patrons of Rome, prominent, St. Lawrence, who's a local boy, and then you've got King David, here's John the Evangelist, and then you have the Virgin and John the Baptist flanking resurrected Christ, and then above is God the Father holding the universe. And beyond that is this realm that is beyond our spheres of the fixed stars. This is the absolute. The vision of Ezekiel talks about the sky opening and the color being the color of either electrum, the alloy of gold and silver, or amber. And here Raphael's clearly opted for electrum. And he's cleverly said that the absolute is outside. He can't paint it. There are things that are so marvelous and so ineffable that he can't paint them. Brilliantly, he's lined the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit above this monstrance of the Eucharist, which is also the vanishing point of the perspective system. And so what you get here is a triumph of theology. And what it's telling you is, yes, you ought to be here. And Rome's role in all of this is that Rome administers the church, which brings heaven to you through the Eucharist in the hands of the priest at Mass. And so here's the motley crew on earth. And you can see a huge building project in the back that we think alludes to St. Peter's. You'll see books strewn all over the place. Possibly this room that's now called the Room of the Signature was the Pope's library. Directly opposite the triumph of theology is the triumph of philosophy, where you can see it's not Christian, it's before. These are all the people who had inklings of what Christianity would be and were instrumental in drawing up theology by merging the Hebrew tradition with the ancient world. So you've got Plato here pointing with one finger, so he's saying there's one God. Aristotle is holding his ethics, labeled nicely in Italian, so everybody will be clear what it is. And he's saying, yes, but everything only makes sense as it's spread out in the world. And he gestures right above our heads. We would be right about, oh, here's a door, so you can tell what human eye level is. And then you've just got all the philosophers you can imagine, and then some Arab commentators on Aristotle. Here's probably Pythagoras. And then right in the middle is this sulky guy who's probably Heraclitus weeping at human folly, but it's a portrait of Michelangelo done in Michelangelo's colors, because Raphael in 1510, this was started in 1509, he was still working on it until 1511, and halfway through working on this fresco of the School of Athens, his uncle Donato Bramante, the architect for Julius II, got him into Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, which had been begun in 1508. He got a sneak preview. And so here he's saying, I can paint like that. I can do those colors. I can do knees as beautiful as Michelangelo. And here are the famous dogskin boots that Michelangelo, I think, must have bought with some of his first payments for the Sistine Chapel ceiling. I've spent years piecing this together, and so I'm not going to go into it because I could go on for hours. Basically, the message here is something that I realized the first time I saw this painting in any form was a partial reproduction in a little art book I got for my 9th birthday. And I loved this painting because I knew whatever else was going on, these were all people who were exactly where they were supposed to be. And the fact that Raphael could communicate this to a 9-year-old is an amazing confirmation of his ability simply to communicate. So what you have is the predecessor to the church. This is the great hall of philosophy. And then you've got the celestial realm and the earthly realm, the way philosophy bridges it, as theology in time will do as well. You have Minerva on one side, who's a Christ figure because she, like Christ, is not born by normal means, and Apollo over here, who's the son of the sun, and therefore the light imagery of Christ. And so you have two different kinds of Christian tradition. It's just filled with marvelous things, but what it's really telling us is that the ancient world, its Jewish strain and its classical strain, were absolutely necessary to understand Christian revelation. If you don't know what a Messiah is, when one comes, you can't do anything with it. The Trinity comes out of Platonic philosophy. And so these are essential aspects of Julius II's all-encompassing vision of what he thought of as a truly Catholic church. Colors are marvelous because, again, Raphael's looking at Michelangelo, he's looking at Leonardo, and he's got immense talents himself. One of the people who's prominent here, Raphael is in a self-portrait there. Just opposite him is Epicurus. Again, this is pleasure and virtue. Epicurus is eat, drink, and be merry. And the person who's playing the role of Epicurus is the librarian of the Vatican Library and the greatest actor in Rome, Tommaso Ingirami, whom you see here being run over by a grain cart. And you can tell Raphael's being very kind to him. This is an extremely flattering portrait of a man who is not wildly attractive. You could see there was a lot of him. He was wall-eyed and bald, and he was spared. Here's Christ the Savior and Saints Peter and Paul saying, please, Christ, save him, not yet. Here's the Colosseum in the background. This is the Arch of Titus with the spoils of the conquest of Jerusalem in 70 AD and some really wild bulls. One of the curators at the Villa Borghese Museum and I have been playing around with whether or not this is an ex voto painted by Raphael, trying to pretend that he's a less gifted painter than he is and tried to do something folksy. I still go back and forth about that all the time, but you can tell this is not your average ex voto. This is somebody who's pretty good. And I think it may be somebody who's brilliant trying to pretend that he's pretty good. Also to be noticed is that Tommaso Ingirami, his Vatican librarian, may be run over, but he's protecting his manuscript with his life. Here's another portrait that Raphael did of Ingirami. He's not a cardinal. This is the robe that you wear if you're a canon of St. Peter's. So he's got a red hat and a red outfit, but he doesn't have the little capelet that makes you a cardinal. And you can see he's wall-eyed. This is a family trait in the Ingirami family. The living Ingiramis still have it and they actually have therapy to correct it, but this has gone marching down the family since time immemorial. And what Raphael does is take a peculiarity and give him a kind of heavenly eye, so that one eye is turned heavenward, one is more earthbound. So you see repeatedly in Raphael's paintings the way he's trying to paint heaven and paint heaven brought down to earth through religion, through inspiration, and through his own art. What he starts doing as an artist is fascinating. So here you've got the features of Tommaso Ingrid, they are what they are, but he starts abstracting the human figure into a symphony of ovals. And you can see it just beautifully here in this drawing, on the back of which you can see the prints. He was also trying to write sonnets like Michelangelo. And between about 1510 and 1514, Raphael figures out that composition is a process of abstraction, and the way that he paints completely changes. And you get paintings like the Madonna of the Chair, 1514, where you can see all of this looks totally lifelike. It's deeply emotional. When I first saw this painting, I really just burst into tears. It's so moving and so perfect. But at the same time, on a technical level, you can see how brilliantly he's just taking the human body and slightly improving it, making it slightly better than it really is, and infusing it with all the human emotion that he's such a master at conveying. And then this painting, the Madonna of the Chair, did not travel, but the Veiled Woman, the Donna Velata, did. It's pretty clearly his girlfriend. It is one of the sexiest paintings ever painted. And not least of his fascinations is the silk sleeve, which is just a tour de force of incredible oil painting. You can see that her face is totally softened. So he's used a sharp edge technique for the sleeve to show his virtuosity. He's showed a kind of gauzy effect here to make the flesh seem almost shimmering and lifelike. And then there's a stray lock of hair here. And again, an ambiguous gesture, as we saw with that early portrayal of pleasure. He always did like women a lot, and it really does show in the way he paints them. And as a woman, I appreciate him for the fact that he appreciates me and he sees the eternal feminine in all of us. But he's also, as we've seen with Tommaso Ingrid, extremely kind to his male friends. Here with Baldassare Castiglione, who's really not got a hair on his head. He's got a wonderful hat to hide the fact. And Raphael concentrates everything on these marvelous blue eyes of Castiglione, except that there's also a little slash of red here. You can't practically see it in the slide, but what the red does to the gray around it is make this furry margin of his elaborate vest absolutely sharp edged. It's just an incredible slash of a color that otherwise has no place in this entire composition except a bit in the flesh tones. And that's a real master at work, where what you do is take reality and you shift it. He's gone for an completely, you'd say blank background, but look how it's changing colors everywhere. You know, there's not one corner of this painting that hasn't been given the utmost care. And Castiglione's wife said when she had the painting, she felt as if she had her husband right with her. This drawing's in the Ashmolean Museum, and I looked at it last year and thought this is fantastic because what you see is telescoping. So here's a Madonna and child, here's the background, and then Raphael is figuring out what to do with the background, telescopes it out. And so he's got this amazingly precise, almost scientific vision of what he's doing with the composition of a painting as he's rationalizing everything into ovals, and he's giving everybody the most poised fingers you've ever had. If you've ever tried to make hands like this, it's not really physically possible. And what I noticed a few years ago, there was a Raphael show at the Prado, and I was looking at this vision of Ezekiel, which I thought, it didn't really hit me that much. I had to confess. I'm more able to appreciate it now, but what suddenly struck me at the Prado, because this is hung eye level, usually it's much higher. And you've got a landscape here that's about 1 inch high. And here's Ezekiel being struck by a beam, and then there's this heavenly vision. So again, you've got heaven and earth. But that landscape in the space of 1 inch is absolutely phenomenal. In art history, they always tell us that the master would do the faces and hands, and assistants would do everything else. Raphael had a huge workshop with some talented people, but none of them had his talents. He gave them a lot of assignments, and what I've realized, especially checking through the Raphael show in Rome, even when I had these 5-minute spurts, I think a lot of this is being assigned to his best assistants, Gian Francesco Penni and Giulio Romano, and he's doing the background. Why not? He can do, as the master, any part of this that he wants. I think he's fascinated by how you portray deep space. We saw it in a much more schematic way in The Triumph of Theology. Here he's really trying to figure out what the sphere beyond the spheres might look like when it breaks open and a vision comes through it. And I can see now better the kinetic energy of God coming down through heaven from deep space in a blast that's like a comet. And here he's really scrutinizing sunrises and sunsets, how clouds work. But my favorite part of that painting remains this unbelievable landscape that really goes back into infinity, even though it's underneath a gigantic cloud with a miraculous vision. The same thing I think is true here with this painting of the Visitation. So this is Elizabeth pregnant with John the Baptist, meeting Mary pregnant with Jesus. I think this is probably Penni and Giulio Romano doing the front, and the background is where Raphael spends his time, where those two babies meet again in the baptism of Christ. And if you look at that baptism of Christ with this amazing electrum colored light, again, I now know that this is a pigment called orpiment. It's extremely rare. It's arsenic sulfate, so it's also extremely poisonous. And I think this is Egyptian blue, which is powdered ceramic. And so what he's doing is using a color he's just recreated from a description by Vitruvius, and here using something of incredible price and unfortunately incredible danger to the painter. And again, you've got this incredible, infinite landscape that I really think only he could do. He's going to depth untold, and then you've got these incredible plays of light on the water. And so while everybody in the Raphael show was looking at the big paintings, I was going up to these little backgrounds and just finding them more and more marvelous every time I look at them, and more likely in my mind to be by his hand. Perhaps his greatest drawing is this sketch for the Transfiguration, which I'll show you in a minute. This is also in the Ashmolean, and you can see how he can create space with draftsmanship, and that as a draftsman, he really is the equal of Michelangelo. He can do old faces, new faces, as my little niece said to my mom once, who was her grandmother, said, "You're old and I'm new. Here's somebody who's old and here's somebody who's new." And Raphael gives them equal respect. And this is where they appear. So this is what the drawing turns into. It's totally different. And what's marvelous about this painting is something you can only say if you step back about 30 feet, that space here is a whirling vortex. It's something that El Greco will really understand. And here you've got a kind of flattened space inspired by Roman relief. And then you've got another of these amazing backgrounds. This was the last painting that Raphael did. It was at his deathbed. And you can see he's been concerned for his entire career with the differences between heaven and earth and how he comes to represent them spatially in different ways. And so he's got an unbelievable versatility. Here he's trying to get the hard-edged effect of ancient sculpture in the great contest that Renaissance artists had, is painting or sculpture greater? Here he's saying, look, Michelangelo, I can do this. I can be sculptural and I can paint at the same time. And here he's doing something that really doesn't pop out the way it should unless you see it live at about a distance of 30 feet. This is what Masolino and Masaccio were painting 100 years earlier. Again, it's the same idea that space works differently in heaven than on earth. These are the rings of the firmament. But what an amazing difference 100 years makes. Raphael knows perspective. He's now flattening it. He's playing with it. And landscape here is glorious, but here it comes to a real climax of virtuosic painting. This is a really bad slide because the Vatican Museums just restored the Hall of Constantine and they deliberately fuzz everything so that you can't take the image. So what the restoration revealed is a lot of spectacular green and two figures that are now thought to be by Raphael. And I went with Heather Hyde Minor to the Vatican Museums the other day. With COVID, you can get in, there's not a line. And I guessed that these were the two figures that Raphael did at the very end of his life. And it turns out I guessed correctly. So it was one of those juvenile things. Let's see if I can find the Raphael. It wasn't hard. These are painted with such incredible spatial feeling. This one's a deliberate challenge to Michelangelo. These are Michelangelo colors right off the Sistine Chapel. And so he's saying, I can do statuesque figures, but they have a kind of gracefulness that yours don't, Mike. And here he's doing something with some of these experimental pigments so that you've got this very peculiar green that I think also comes from his readings of Vitruvius. And that's my breathless run through the Raphael show, which gives us about half an hour as planned. And I'm so relieved that I didn't go on and on and on.
Ingrid, thank you so much. There is this applause and there is imaginary applause. And dear audience, please feel free to ask questions through the Q&A button. Ingrid, may I please start with a question of a more personal nature? I'm as much interested in the genius of Ingrid as I'm interested in the genius of Raphael. So when you talked about all these beautiful paintings, about the Trinity, the Visitation, the Transfiguration, there are all these religious motives. And I was wondering, how would you say does your professional engagement with these paintings impact your relationship with the church or even your personal faith, if I may ask so?
Yeah, it's funny because I have a number of friends who've been influenced by these paintings in the same way. And basically, Raphael was a Neoplatonic Christian, which Augustine was as well. Mm-hmm. So that when it's in good company in the Gospel of John. And so what it does is take your faith in a definitely Neoplatonic direction. And I know people
Ingrid, you need to talk to the mic. It's a little.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, please.
Is this better?
Much better.
Yeah, because I know those paintings have actually done their job of conversion.
Got it.
And I am myself a lifelong Episcopalian, and so that's always interesting. And you can see because they date from the time before the schism between the Catholic and the Protestant church, right before.
Right.
And one of the subjects I've also gotten really interested in, because Raphael worked with the wealthy banker Agostino Chigi.
Mm-hmm.
And both of them were involved with the Augustinian order. And I was wondering about Chigi and Jakob Fugger, who funded all of Luther's opponents.
Okay, okay.
And I've come to realize that there's a lot of economic politics going on in the Reformation, because Luther was backed by an elector who had not been elected by money supplied by Fugger. And a lot of Luther's concerns as the son of a copper smelter was that he was seeing good metal, leaving Germany and getting paper back with promises.
Got it.
And so I've had a really interesting time just studying the spirituality of that period, but I've really, like many people who study the Augustinian leader at that time, Giles of Viterbo, become very hooked on his theology, which I love. It's an ecumenical, outward-looking theology. It has a lot to do with where the Jesuits end up. And my next step in research is I work on this crazy Jesuit Athanasius Kircher, who's the next century.
Yes, yes.
And so, in fact, I find that working on these things is a great reinforcement for one's faith.
Great. Thank you, Ingrid. We have the first questions come in. The first question is from Heather Minor. What did it mean for Raphael to run a workshop? What does it tell us about Raphael as a kind of impresario? What was Raphael Ink. Like?
It was a lot like Agostino Chigi and Jakob Fugger. So it was one of the biggest industrial operations of an era in which suddenly you're getting a lot of people with wide-ranging ideas. So there's kind of a sovereign idea. In Chigi and Fugger's case, it's metal. And with metal, I can rule the world. They parcel out the metals of the early 16th century among them. With Julius, it's with the church, I can rule the world. And he identifies himself personally with the church. With Raphael, it is I, through art, can take human creativity in every form and communicate the truth of the church to the widest possible ecumenical Catholic, in that sense, audience. With Bramante, it's I can make the city and the church that are so beautiful that the world will understand the theological apparatus that our Pope Julius II believes in. Julius has a highly articulated view of the church, just as Chigi's got an articulated view of commerce, as does Fugger. And then you've got Raphael, who's the master of mass communication. And then Tommaso Inghirami, his obese friend, is so good at projecting his voice. He was made the secretary of the Lateran Council because he could be heard from one end of the basilica to the next.
I see. Thank you, Ingrid. We have many more questions coming in. Our postdoctoral associate, Dr. Kettler, has a question. Does the social, political, cultural, and intellectual climate of the city of Rome lend a particular influence to Raphael's growing technical acumen, or is this more a process of technical maturation and practice?
I think it's really studying hard the example of the ancients. It's just relentless study. He's also studying all the works of art and architecture and painting and sculpture. So he's studying things like the mosaics of Santa Maria Maggiore, which are late antique. He doesn't rule out anything. He'll look at medieval things. He realizes the strong classical tradition. So I think it's a combination of maturing technique, and it's maturing technique honed by competition with Michelangelo and all of his associates, plus competition with antiquity and self-criticism that never quits. And then he's got those, Giulio Romano is really smart and really rebellious. And so I think Giulio's spurring him on in the way our best students just needle us into being better than we were without them.
Thank you. We have a question on, in one of your essays, you write about Raphael's influence on the planning and architecture of the city. Could you say a little about his impact on the city as an urban space?
It turns out my friend Brian Kelly, who's a Notre Dame graduate, has been working a lot, and he and I have been working together. It turns out that the palazzi that Raphael designed were huge, totally innovative. And so what he's doing is taking the classical vocabulary, stripping it down to what he sees as essential elements, and then recomposing it to make these palazzi that suddenly seem super modern by looking super ancient. And they're huge. They're so much bigger. When we look at them today, they're dwarfed by the city, which grew about 1 story every century. And the definition of what a story was grew by several feet every century. And so what Brian Kelly, my friend, did is do a mock-up of what Rome would have looked like and then grafted these palazzi onto it. And they just loom in the landscape. So as you were walking to St. Peter's, which is going up, redesigned by his uncle Bramante, you've got these giant colonnades and you think you're almost in ancient Rome, but you're in Christian Rome. So it's classical monumentality with Christian conviction.
Thank you. Excellent. We have 2 questions from students, and normally we try to ask them as quickly and early as possible. One student asked, and I may group the 2 together, please, how prominent was Christianity as a topic of painting during Raphael's era? And the second question from a student is, were there any explicit or implicit political statements made by Raphael in his works?
Let's see, answer to religion is one of the most important branches. And so when the Renaissance begins, you don't really have so much a concept of art as art. What you do is paint altarpieces. Everything has a practical purpose. So you're either you're decorating a palazzo or you're making an altarpiece. Altarpieces were one of the most important ways that you could establish yourself. If you can do a fresco, it's a wall decoration for a pope, that's really great. But yes, religious themes are really prominent, but he's also interested in mythology. And often what he'll do is take a religious scene and try to mythologize it, to give it the same kind of presentation that he does a classical myth. See, and the other question,
the question was the political statements, any explicit or implicit political statements?
A lot. And depending, if you're working for Julius, everything's political because he thinks he is the church. There's a definite Franciscan tendency in public art in Rome. One of the few exceptions is Pope Nicholas V, who's in with the Dominicans, but because Francis was an Italian saint, and say Julius II and his uncle Sixtus IV are both Franciscans, and that means there's a lot of Marian imagery, which isn't, it's political in the sense that the Franciscans are arguing all the time with the Dominicans about whether or not the Immaculate Conception is true. The Dominicans are against it, the Franciscans are for it, and so there's a position in that debate, a lot of this ecumenical message is aimed also to the New World, because the head of the Augustinians is saying, look, the fact that there are all of these people on the other side of the earth means that the mission of the church can finally reach a completion that was not possible before. And so they look upon their period as a period of renovation in an absolute sense. With Julius, that also means adding to the Papal States anybody who was part of his temporal realm, like Bologna, who were trying to act independent. He goes and smacks them into shape, or attempts to smack them into shape. And so he ran military expeditions. Raphael doesn't do anything about that, but what Raphael does is promote the theology that inspires Julius to be so aggressive in the protection of what he sees as his territory.
Thank you. Dear friends, we have 12 more questions and we have 12 more minutes. We will be respectful of your time, and especially also Ingrid's time, who still has something else to do afterwards, believe it or not. And so I already apologize that we will not be able to tackle all the questions, but we'll make our way through them. Ingrid, a question by David Meyernick, your colleague in architecture. How has your own drawing and painting informed your understanding of Raphael?
Now, I have to say here that I owe everything to David Meyernick and Father Martin. And so they've made me
Thank you.
Colors completely different. I know Father Martin's going to see this on tape, but David started teaching me painting a couple of years ago. It's just transformed everything. And I painted as a kid, but it was abstract expressionism. Those were the days. And so it's really helped me get inside a lot of these things. I see much more clearly by painting myself. So the way colors work is easier to understand if you have to do it yourself. Pigment's easier to recognize if you're playing with it. And so it's transformed everything and made it way more exciting. And speaking of people who derive their maturation from relentless study and relentless practice, that's David.
Beautiful. So David, thank you not only for the question, but also what you have done, for Ingrid to answer the question this way. Ted Catchy has the question, can you say something about the cosmology / metaphysics that informed Raphael's painting? What was his vision of the cosmos that comes through the painting, namely the vision of Ezekiel,
Yeah, he's got this idea that is showing up a lot in the early 16th century. They really want to get to that realm beyond the fixed stars. And so if you think of that Masaccio Mazzolino painting, there's a circle and the circle has gold outside it. And that's the circles are the orbits. And they want to make it more plausible, not a schematic diagram. They really want to know what it's made of. And by the end of the 16th century, people are concluding that space is a fluid rather than crystalline spheres. And I'm wondering now that Ted put me onto this chain of thought, I think maybe what we're seeing is space as a fluid happening before our amazed eyes. And then it's going to get at the end of the century to Giordano Bruno saying space is infinite, but Robert Bellarmine, who's on the other side of his trial, nearly went before the Inquisition for maintaining that space was fluid. So that's the way things are going cosmologically.
Beautiful. Thank you. We have a question. Does your approach towards analyzing a work of Raphael differ depending on if the work was commissioned or not? If so, how?
If it's commissioned and I know the person, then I'll tend to look for certain things. So what we can do is a formal analysis that just looking at the data of the form of the painting, so color, shape, all of that. But if you know something, so Agostino Chigi, I know a lot about his banking, I know about his religious faith, and so that does inform it. Actually, what's interesting to me, I would not have given this talk this way 5 years ago. That's where the painting kicks in, because then I would have talked on and on about the literary texts that I've read that inform my interpretation of the School of Athens, and gone second to color and shape. And right now I'm on to color and shape, as that can inform back all of the knowledge I have of the behind the scenes. And then I've got this whole Agostino Chigi and Jakob Fugger and the metallic Reformation that's really, metals are driving me crazy.
Thank you, Ingrid. We have two questions about Michelangelo and Raphael. One from a student: was it typical for artists during Raphael's era to try to one-up each other like Raphael did with Michelangelo?
Yes.
I enjoy the rivalry between these phenomenal, influential artists. We saw Raphael's portrait of Michelangelo. Did Michelangelo respond in kind or start this visual acknowledgement of his rival?
He'd never confess so.
Okay.
And such was his ego that, but you can tell that he's looking, and they're just scrutinizing each other, and then they're stealing anything that's not nailed down and trying to put it into their own art because they realize. And then there's Titian, and both of them know Titian's working. Titian knows they are. Raphael's exchanging drawings with Dürer. And so everybody's looking at everybody, and they're smart enough to know that looking at other people's work will make them better. I should also say, just one of the Sistine Chapel walls done by Julius II's uncle, what he did is name 5 artists and say, okay, guys, paint my chapel, knowing they'll do their best work as fast as they can because they don't want to be shown up by their buddies. And so everybody's working double speed to show how fast they can work, and doing really great work because they want to show their buddies that they're the best, and work pretty well.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Ingrid. Another student's question from Matt. Why do you think Raphael painted himself into the School of Athens? Was this common practice?
Yeah, it's common practice. I think if you're happy with what you did, I don't know anybody, is the places I can think of. Mantegna painted himself into the Camera degli Sposi. Ghiberti sculpted himself onto his doors in Florence. Pisanello, sorry. Filarete has his self-portrait on his bronze doors. So everybody's putting, Luca Signorelli's got himself in his Apocalypse in Orvieto. So it's standard to put yourself, if you think you did a good job, and often you'll even put your colleagues in. And that's why I think Ingirami's in there, because he probably, as librarian, helped Raphael figure out who should go where.
Thank you. Interesting. A question from Chiara Spordoni. Thinking of the Stanza della Segnatura, I was wondering if you could say something more about the relationship Raphael had as a reader with literature, and literature in the Italian vernacular in particular.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that has come up recently, I was supposed to write something about Diogenes Laertius's Lives of the Philosophers in Rome. And so I thought, oh, great, I'll go to the Vatican Library. I'll find a nice manuscript that everybody used. I'll trace it to the School of Athens, and it'll be great. I went through all the Diogenes Laertius in the Vatican Library, the Latin manuscripts, and I was maybe the second person ever to read them.
Wow.
The owner maybe thought they were all stiff. Nobody read these things.
Wow. Yeah.
And then what are they reading? They're reading this little handy dandy, cheap paper, Italian vernacular, Lives of the Philosophers Digest. And those are totally thumbed over. The only person who even got close to it in Greek was Egidio da Viterbo, the head of the Augustinians. And so it was fascinating. The only person who really did his homework was Egidio da Viterbo, Raphael's friend. And I think Raphael's talking a lot to Ingirami. He's talking to Angelo Colocci, who's got a fabulous personal library. And I don't know when he had time to read, but I think he's reading Vitruvius definitely cover to cover and really working on it. He must not have slept a whole lot because he's got girlfriends, he's reading things, but my money is on those cheap little paper books that everybody's reading.
Beautiful. Maybe a last question, 2 minutes before the end. We end with a student question on a positive note. Why were Raphael's paintings so thematically positive? Was this typically or idiosyncratic for the time? Was it a continuity with earlier moments or a break with the past?
That's really interesting question. Some of his nature was supposed to be so sunny because his mother nursed him. He wasn't set out to a wet nurse. Oh. And so he was one of those wonderful, cheerful people by reputation, whereas Michelangelo, you could see he's sulking. And so he was your classic melancholic. He's positive, I think, partly just because he's got, Julius is positive in his own way. He's surrounded by rather cheerful people, even though in the case of Julius and Agostino Chigi, they were willing to send out troops to defend their positive view of the universe. But Egidio da Viterbo was a real reconciler, and I think that's characteristic of this period in Rome. It's one of the times from the time of Sixtus IV in 1471, 1483, maybe it's 1484, but that period through Julius and slightly his successor Leo before Luther gets to him is really positive. It's the least anti-Semitic period in Rome. And so I think the positivity is very much the zeitgeist.
The zeitgeist. Thank you, Ingrid. Positivity we need in 2020 and beyond. Ingrid, thank you so much for a beautiful lecture and for your gracious way of handling our questions. Thank you to our dear audience for listening and watching and giving us questions. Apologies that we couldn't attend to all of them. Thank you also to Connor, Grant, and Jenny for the technological support in making this happen. I just want to let you know that on October 13th, we have another virtual lecture delivered by our very own postdoctoral associate, Dr. Mark Kettler, on the Christ of Nations, German veneration of Austria-Hungary in the First World War. Till then, stay tuned. Ingrid, thank you so much. Have a good evening. Good luck with your next endeavor and enjoy your dinner after, I guess, once this is over. Thank you and goodbye to you all. Bye-bye now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.